With the help of the Lord, we wish to consider these important subjects according to the series for the seminar on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The chronological development of the subject on divorce and remarriage in Adventism is extremely important to have the clear background connected with the statements that we find in the official papers of Adventism and also in the inspired word of the testimonies. And that is the main purpose of this first slide that we have in front of us. We are going to consider the colonial era related with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And this covers approximately the period of time in the United States from 1620 to the Revolutionary War or the War of Independence. And it's very important to understand this previous situation, especially because this influenced in a very intensive way the legal code and the general legislation related with divorce in the history of the United States. So during the colonial period, the colonies in the east side of the American continent, North American continent, were under the leadership of the British Empire. And one of the first colonies established is the Plymouth colony, and they regulated divorce. In fact, at least 9 divorces were granted during 72 years history since 1620. And in fact, is one of the first European settlements in New England. Considering this clear concept is sometimes contradictory to see that the Church of England, for example, was very restrictive in regulations of divorce. But the colonies and the people that moved there have the purpose to set them free from all these very according to them, old-fashioned and against the scripture regulations. So divorce was established, for example, in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. And in fact, until the end of the century, they already registered 44 divorces. Connecticut make also provisions for divorce in 1640. And according to the reports, at least 40 divorces occurred over the next 6 decades. And as I have said, even at the same time, the Church of England, along with the most Catholic European countries, didn't allow divorce. But the Pilgrims established these provisions for divorce. So divorcing policies and the general practices were very conservative in the middle colonies. We need to consider 3 main levels in the colonies: the northern colonies, the middle ones, and the south ones. So, for example, the middle colonies such as New York and Pennsylvania, these colonies granted divorce occasionally in cases only of adultery, desertion, of bigamy. But in the southern colonies, divorce was not possible under no circumstances, at least in the first period of the colonial era. It's interesting to find here that the people that settled in the southern colonies were closely followed the teaching of the Anglican Church. And also, even if they were extremely strict, there are some reference of limited divorces in case of separation from bed and board. So, with other words, the colonial era established divorce laws that differ. They are different according to colony or colony, and after will be also state to state. So even after the independence, the southern states were even very cautious related with the grounds of allowing divorce. For example, only in cases of imprisonment, adultery, impotence, and desertion. The case of South Carolina, for example, that was the most conservative state of the South, did not establish divorce in any circumstances until 1868. And in fact, despite South Carolina's effort to allow marital dissolution from the pressure of the legislation, the divorce clause was repealed in 1878, even though relatively few divorces had been granted during the preceding 10 years. So with this general overview, we see that already in the colonial era, even if the colonies were under the British Empire and in the countries of Europe, divorce was not allowed in general terms, some level of liberality was consent toward the colonies. With the Revolutionary War or the Independent Wars that covered 1775 until 1783 through the 19th century, we find that the 13 colonies that now become 13 states quickly formalized the divorce laws. They were very carefully and very differential, considering, as I have mentioned, North states, intermediate states, and South states. So, but generally they have in common that always need to be a causative reasoning, need to be a cause. And these causes need to be with enough weight to be considered for implementation of divorce. But in general, was not an easy process and even less quickly a one. The point of this process was very interesting because with the expansionism toward West, and the annexation of new territories and the establishment of territories that apply for statehood become a more liberal position toward divorce in the new territories in process to become states. That was relatively easy in these new territories, and this produced a disbalance socially in this relatively new country. So in 1881, especially the population of the East Coast was very much concerned about the development of moral, family, and ethical background of the American society. So they founded what was called the New England Divorce Reform League. So, in fact, that was the first organization with the specific goal of restricting liberal divorce and regulated more substantial reasons that legally needed to be evident. And in fact, the main goal was to encourage more research and deeply and seriousness approach to this subject. Some success was achieved through this New England Divorce Reform League, with the point that the new territories applying for statehood needed to be more balanced in the process of the older states in the East Coast related with divorce laws. So by the 19th century, the family law, even if it was not completely cohesive in all the states, older states, or new territories and new becoming states, one concept was common, and that was the family law. So what was marriage by the 19th century America? How was defined? And I have used the mid-19th century edition of Western Dictionary, 1856, about marriage, and it's defined the following way. The act of uniting man and woman as husband and wife for life. And that is a very important statement because generally was recognized, implemented as family law in the general structured administrative system of the country. Now, by the 19th centuries, this definition, according to the social context, was considering 4 overlapping elements. One of them was marriage united a man and a woman, giving them a singular identity, and that is marriage. Even if it's plural, becomes singular as institution. The second element is the marriage transform men and woman into husband and wives. So it's also a change of state because they don't call anymore man or woman, but is also a new qualified adjective here, and is husband and wives. The third element, very, very important, is that marriage produces a public relationship. So it's a social structure because with marriage is associated family, and in fact was considered the basic element of society. In this third element is considered that the terms of this relationship, marriage one, were not negotiable by the parties because the marriage is already a family law clearly defined. Number 4, that is very important also, is that marriage affected a permanent transformation, one that will continue as long as both husband and wife survive. So this general understanding of marriage was common by all the states, territory, and applicants for statehood. Now, by the first years of the 19th century, they already existed diverse jurisdictional landscape of divorce. All states already understood divorce and implemented this concept as a public process and was allowed only with public reasons. The divorce laws did not modify the concept of marriage, and that is very, very important. So the concept of marriage became very, very stable, and divorce was only the appendix of it and was considered always an element of study, research, and exception. And it's very interesting that the fact that the divorce laws in different states were implemented with some variations, more with a liberal tendency or conservative one, all of them consider the obligation of the contract for life. And this element is extremely important to consider at this point. When you look at this map, for example, you see the growth of the United States in 1783 through 1853. So when we began to understand that United States is not a cohesive country with the expansion in the geographical territory border to border, Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean at once, this helps us to understand that the laws, the requirements were extremely flexible and adaptive according to the circumstances. When they received the independence, they covered only this green line, original 13 colonies becoming new independent 13 states all along the Atlantic Ocean. Then we have the extension to the Ohio River Valley from until the Mississippi River. And then the next expansionism is the Louisiana Purchase. Then we have also ceded by Great Britain, part of North Section, the Texas annexation, the Mexican cession, and the Oregon Country. So during all this process from east to west, working according to the system of the manifest destiny in American history, we need to consider the position of the Seventh-day Adventists since the beginning. That is the historical context that Sister White was living in and all the pioneers at this time. So it's very important that you keep that in mind, because this will help us to understand why they were so ambiguous or not enough clear in many of the resolutions that they took as General Conference, based exactly in this process of expansionism, diversification of laws in a country that was in process of formation, okay? So the first reference that we have here related with the original sources of Seventh-day Adventists is in 1862, and that is in the Michigan State Conference. That is the first one that is organized, where all the majority of the members were located at that time. So one of the first questions raised in 1862, and the question was, how shall we treat divorcee marriages? And that stayed in the minutes. Joseph Bates was in charge of it in October 14, 1862, under the title Business Proceedings of the Michigan State Conference. And this question was brought by Brother Sanborn, who needed an answer to a practical question. So the new converters that are divorced, so how they are going to be accepted or rejected in the initial group of Adventists at that time. So unfortunately, in the minutes, we don't have the answer. We have only the question. We don't have a record of any subsequent action until approximately 35 years after, and we will come back to that. But we realize here that since the beginning of the early pioneers in 1862, already they confronted this important question: how you introduce people that are divorced inside of the church. In 1863, we find a very important statement of Sister White. And here is from 1863, is a letter that in our second presentation we will consider in detail. But here the important element for us is how Sister White compare and contrast the laws of the land and the laws of God. Let us read it. A woman may be legally divorced from her husband by the laws of the land, and yet not divorced in the sight of God. And according to the higher law, there is only one sin, which is adultery, which can place the husband or wife in a position where they can be free from the marriage vow in the sight of God. Although the laws of the land may grant a divorce, yet they are husband and wife still in the Bible light, according to the laws of God. So that was an element of discussion. So how far is possible to combine, as Sister White said, the laws of the land and the laws of God, or with other words, the higher law, or the light given us by the Bible. And she presented very clearly that the only reason to apply for divorce will be that adultery happened. And that is an important element that still is in process of discussion, because we will see that in 1879, that is the second record that we have from the General Conference sessions that this subject is presented and delivered. So here is one of the early attempts to generate an official attempt to arrive to a policy related with this subject. So a committee was created with the subject how to deal with unhappy marriages. So a commission from the General Conference session in 1879 was created with this purpose. So they presented a report considering the social issues, the reality inside of the church, and again, this comparison between the laws of the land and the law of God. So the first element that is very clear in the report is that this alarming tendency in the general public toward lax views of marriage. So they underline very strongly the fact that in the general public, people believe that divorce need to be made easier, accessible, and with plurality of reasons. And that is the reason why they recommended that the church had the responsibility to stay the tide of corruption. That was sweeping the country. That is exactly the period of time of expansionism, easy divorce in the new territories, lack of legislation in these new areas that were in process of annexation. And they were concerned about this situation. And that is very clear presented is a handwriting minutes of the 1879 General Conference session. So they formulated several proposals to submit to a vote. So let me read it for you, and we will see how the delegates in this General Conference session reacted toward that. So the first one was, whereas there is at the present time an alarming tendency in the public sentiment toward extremely lax views on the subject of the marriage relation, and whereas legal divorces are now granted by the courts for causes which are in themselves utterly insufficient as the basis of such action, and whereas we are anxious, as far as lies in our power, to stay the tide of corruption which is thereby inunding the nation. So the public courts were in a process of facilitating divorce. Until this moment, the main concept to apply for divorce was adultery. Now we find here the confirmation, and we already have it according to the legal procedures, that different causes can be presented beside adultery, and divorce was granted. So they were concerned about this situation and what to do. So let us see what they resolve. So resolve number one, that after mature deliberation, we express it as our conviction that the New Testament is plainly teaches the fact that there is in this dispensation but one sufficient cause for divorce, and that it is alone to be found in the commission of the sin of adultery by one or the other of the parties to the marriage contract. So, even if the law of the land offered more options to get a divorce beside adultery, they resolved it that the only way how the church can consider divorce is under one single and sufficient cause, and that is because of the sin of adultery. So we see here a separation between the general trend in the legal area and the position of the church at this time. So they resolve also a second element, at least they try to do it. So that the second element was that we must earnestly recommend it, that in all things our churches should pursue a course in harmony with the above principles, by refusing to receive into their numbers any persons who have been divorced for any other cause than that of adultery, and have subsequently been married to another person, with whom he or she is living in the relation of husband or wife, during the lifetime of the person from whom such individual was improperly divorced. So from a statement, we go to a recommendation. So let us summarize a little bit. So the resolution number 1 was the only possibility to apply for divorce, and that will be accepted by the church, is when the sin of adultery is committed. Now, the second resolution was a recommendation that if people wish to be part of the church, but they are coming in a divorcee condition, and they divorce and remarry without the fulfillment of this only cause accepted by the church, that is adultery, they cannot be accepted. That is a recommendation, and they say, we hope that the churches pursue this about principle. Okay, so let us go to resolution number 3 in the General Conference 1879. Number 3 is that in all cases where it shall be found that there are members of existing churches who are living together as man and wife in violation of the foregoing principles, such cases shall not be dealt with until the advice of the General Conference Committee, or that of the Conference Committee of the state to which the church belongs, shall have been sought and obtained. So, resolution number 3 explained to us that they already have irregularities among the organized churches in the different states, because resolution number 1 was given in 1879. But if before this resolution people were added to the church, remarried, that didn't divorce from the previous marriage only under the cause of adultery, they cannot immediately disfellowship them. They need to consider case by case, and they need to appeal to the field committee and even to the committee of the General Conference. So this shows us that already was a very difficult situation at this moment. Now, but let us continue by the next General Conference session in 1887. And then were presented several proposals for resolution. And consider that we are in the 19th century. We are already in this moment that we already historical presented. So, whereas our Savior had laid down the one sole ground on which parties once married can be divorced. So 10 years after, this General Conference confirmed that is only one reason, and this need to be adultery. Now, whereas the praxis of society have become most deplorable in this respect, as seen in the prevalence of unscriptural divorce, therefore, we resolve that we express our deprecation of this great evil and instruct our ministers not to unite in marriages any party so divorce. Okay, now, we see here that in different states, several irregularities and so-called exceptions emerge. And because of the existence of this situation, we find here a clear statement that says that the instruction given by the General Conference in session in 1887 is that the ministers don't unite in marriage any parties that are divorced in such a way. Okay? So that is important for us to understand. So for them, in 1887, without doubt, the only adultery was grounds for divorce. Now, but that was not so easy. That was the proposal. Let us see how the delegates reacted. So to the first proposal, that was passed unanimously, that the only reason for divorce is adultery. Now, the second proposal that will forbid churches from accepting into membership anyone who had been divorced for reasons other than adultery and subsequently remarry, the refusal of membership was to remain during the lifetime of the person from whom such individual was improperly divorced. So here is introduced a modification related with the previous one. So connected with the third resolution that proposed that the cases of all current members living in questionable second marriages be dealt with only. And here is established an administrative procedure. They need to deal in the following way: only after the local church saw advice from the General Conference Committee, or at least the local conference committee. So if they have a situation like that, they cannot rush the implementation. They need to have previous consultation and request for advice from the General Conference Committee and at least from the local conference committee. Okay, so we see here how difficult and how sensitive this subject already was. Now, let us see how the delegates change orientation immediately after. Because the first of these resolutions, that the only reason for divorce is adultery, passed unanimously. But the second and the third resolution created dissent. And the leaders withheld a decision till after the most mature deliberation. So they somehow retroactive put in reserve the second and the third resolution. And the records that we have inform us that both James and Ellen White participated in this discussion. And on the third day, all three resolutions, including the first one that has already passed, were tabled permanently, although we have no record of what the various participants says, but it is clear that the leaders didn't come to agreement on the proposed resolution for the second and the third one. So these remain ambiguous and somehow undefined at this moment. Now, during this period of time, we have the church papers view. And here is where sometimes a lot of difficulties emerge, because the Review and Herald published some 15 articles, comments, and answers to questions and responses of readers on the subject of divorce and remarriage from 1862 to 1900s. So here is the thing. The position held by the Review and Herald has been consistent through the years. So when you read all these 15 articles, you can see that, okay, it's the same idea and is cohesive in the process of time. That adultery is the only reason for divorce. Now, different elements are mentioned that are not connected with the resolutions of the General Conference. And please keep attention here, because generally the Review and Herald that are even not writings of Sister White, are not articles of Sister White, are considered like the final statement and position of Seventh-day Adventists. And unfortunately, that is not the case, because we cannot assert that these were the official position of the church, because are not General Conference resolutions that confirm that all the statements presented in the Review and Herald are confirmed by the delegate session. We don't have that. So that is very doubtful. At least it represents Uriah Smith's viewpoint during the time he was editor of the paper. And we know that because, especially for the subject of justification by faith, was a collision, a very strong confrontation between Signs of the Times and Review and Herald in the subject related with the barbarian tribes and the subject justification by faith. So it's very interesting that we don't have a correlation between the resolutions of the General Conference that I have presented to you and those 15 articles presented in the Review and Herald under the leadership of Uriah Smith that expose concepts such as innocent party, guilty party. All these concepts are not present at all in any of the resolutions of the General Conference. So we cannot support and connect it, these statements of the Review and Herald, in equal consistency with the resolutions taken by the General Conference. And it's very interesting. For example, of particular interest were two notes published by Uriah Smith in 1888, January 11 and February 8, and I encourage you to read it. Because of the time, I am unable to do so. So here is presented, first deals with a specific case of remarriage other than adultery. The second focus on other cases cited by the readers and their response, as well as the position of the editors. So even if it's an official paper of the church, we need to weigh correctly the content of the Review and Herald with the resolutions of the General Conference. And when we put that in contrast, only one concept is in harmony, is that the only reason for divorce is adultery. All the other exceptions, terminology are not in existence in the resolution of the General Conference. And that is very important for us to keep in mind. And that is important because during the lifetime of Sister White, occasionally she also participated in discussions of church policy. And she expressed herself only in very specific cases. And she resists serving as the authority to resolve cases. In fact, it's very important, the declaration of the Sister Ellen G. White in Manuscript 2, 1913, and say, I do not think it is my work to deal with any such things unless the case has been plainly open before me. I cannot take responsibility in such matters. Let those appointed of God to bear the responsibility deal within accordance with Christian principles. So she transferred the general position to the General Conference. And we know already the two General Conference sessions that pronounce themselves about this situation. and they were undefined. And in no case, this terminology that we have in the Review and Herald from a guilty party or unguilty party are mentioned here. So these kind of elements are very important us to have in a separate context, because belong to different levels of organization. And Sister White insists here clearly that the resolutions of the higher authority are the ones to be followed. And she only pronounced herself about very specific cases that don't create legislature. And that is very important for us to understand. I have added also about the son of Sister White, January 6, 1931, when he quoted, it's an unpublished manuscript, but he described the situation as following. It was Sister White's intention that there should not go forth from her pen anything that could be used as a law or a rule in dealing with these questions of marriage, divorce, remarriage, and adultery. And that confirmed the statement in manuscript 2, 1913, where Sister White personally led the general opinion to the leadership of the General Conference. So it's very important for us to have this clear understanding and differentiation between the official papers, the resolutions of the delegation, and also the standpoint of Sister White, limited exclusively to specific cases. So we will go in detail in the cases that she mentioned in the next PowerPoint. So may the Lord help us to understand that and lead us in His principles, is my wish and prayer. Amen.